皆様、こんばんは。第4回JCCNC セミナーにご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。本日は講師にエグフォワード社のアレン・ギルマンさんをお呼びしまして、ハイブリッドワークの未来とパフォーマンスマネジメントという会員企業様にも関心の高い内容となっておりまして、JCCNC、JBA の会員企業様含め、時点登録で119名と多数のお申し込みをいただいております。皆様、ご参加いただきましてありがとうございます。これから講義を開始いたします。45分の講義と、それから10分間、終わりに Q&A の時間を設けております。そして、最後にセミナー委員会の方からのご連絡事項を、お伝えいたしまして、西海岸時間で6時終了を予定しております。なお、今回のご講演は英語での進行となりますので、ご承知おきください。Q&A は随時、皆さんお送りいたしますので、この、Zoom の一番下にあります Q&A のところに、書き込んでいただいて結構でございます。英語、日本語、どちらでも大丈夫です。ただし、回答の方は先ほど申しましたように、最後にまとめてお答えすることといたします。また、次後、皆さんにお送りする予定、資料はお送りする予定でございます。また、YouTube にも、今回の講義を、ポスティングいたしますので、見逃された方もご視聴いただくことが可能となります。それでは、エグフォワードの、高林さん、進行の方よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、佐々木様ありがとうございます。エッグフォワードの高林と申します。本日は金曜日の夕方という貴重なお時間にお集まりくださいましてありがとうございます。簡単に私どもの紹介をさせていただきます。本社は東京の表参道にありまして、人事戦略のコンサルティングを主な事業としております。海外部門におきましては、アメリカをはじめ、中国や東南アジアの日系企業に対して、現地化や組織開発のプロジェクト、そしてそれに伴う人材育成の仕事をさせていただいております。本日は長年日米案件を多く扱ってきましたアレン・ギルマンよりお話しさせていただきます。Okay, Alan.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'd like to tell you briefly a little bit about myself before we begin. I am working as a senior consultant with Egg Ford, and I have been living and working actually in Tokyo, Japan for about 20 years, working as a consultant and coach and trainer, specifically on cross-cultural management, leadership mindset, and communication also. I'd also like to add one personal thing about me. I'm sure that many of you have traveled to Okinawa before. I was actually born in Okinawa. My mother is from Japan. My father is from the US. And so growing up, I have always been very interested in cross-cultural issues. So that's one reason why I'm very happy to be with you here today and have the chance to speak to you. The second reason is that our topic for today is actually very timely and a very important topic. And that is, what is the future of performance management and hybrid work? Now, before we begin, I'd like to ask all of you a quick question that you can answer. And this is poll question number 1. And the question is, on average, how many jobs do you think Americans have in a lifetime? Right? And I'll give you guys 30 seconds to answer before continuing. So go ahead and input your answers. Okay, and time. Okay, very good. Okay, so the answer to the question is for males, the average number of jobs they have in a lifetime in the US is 12.6 jobs. And for females, it's 12.3 jobs. That's quite different from Japan. And I can see that actually 9% of you actually got the answer right. So that's very interesting. I'm sure many people thought that it would be lower than that. Now, on average, for people who are 18 to 24 years old, they tend to work about 5.7 jobs in their lifetime. Whereas people who are 25 to 34 years old tend to work about 4.5 jobs. And then, of course, as people get older, for example, the 45 to 52-year-old category, it slows down and they work on average 1.9 jobs. But that's still quite a high number, especially compared to Japan. And so that's one thing that we need to keep in mind about workers in the US is the reasons that they're working at companies can be different than reasons that Japanese employees work at companies in Japan. Now, this is especially, we could especially see this when the pandemic started, what's called the Great Resignation, where from April to September of 2021, 24 million Americans left their jobs. So we had a real big spike in people leaving their jobs. And according to MIT, the reasons why they were leaving are a little bit surprising, actually, right? Maybe a little bit surprising to you. If you can see on the left side here, the number one reason for leaving jobs was toxic culture. I think when people started to isolate during the pandemic, then they started to reconsider, do they really want to be working at this company? And if the culture was more toxic, then people were more quick to leave their jobs. In fact, people left jobs, who left jobs because of the toxic culture were 10.4 times higher than people leaving due to pay, to compensation, right? And this was by far the biggest reason. Now, some other reasons why people were leaving, job insecurity and reorganization of companies, high levels of innovation. Now, you might be surprised by that, but what that means is some people who were working in highly competitive, high pressure, innovative companies felt that it was the right time to leave, maybe due to stress in that situation during the pandemic. Fourth reason was a failure to recognize people for their performance. And the fifth one was poor response to COVID-19. So what do we mean by toxic corporate culture? And according to MIT, toxic corporate culture meant, for example, a failure to promote diversity, equity, a lack of inclusion, feeling disrespected by other employees, or just unethical behavior. But this was one big reason why people were leaving during the pandemic in the beginning. Now, one thing that we can see now is that priorities have changed for workers in the United States. People now, compared to before the pandemic, are much more likely to prioritize their health and well-being. This includes not only physical well-being, but also mental well-being, right? And on this slide, we can see on the right side here that there's a breakdown in terms of generations, right? So 51% of Generation Z employees are more likely to prioritize health and well-being now than before the pandemic. For millennials, this goes even higher, with 55% of them prioritizing health and well-being. So this is a new priority that has increased compared to before. Now, also, a lot of Americans are recalculating whether their job is really worth it or not. And so 41% of employees are actually considering leaving their current employer right now. And 46% are likely to move because they can work remotely. So there's a large expectation now to be able to work remotely or even in a hybrid environment. In some research, a large portion of the people who are considering working remotely or who prefer to work remotely are people, for example, African Americans, women, especially women who have children, and other minorities. Now, in terms of working remotely or hybrid, 52% of employees right now prefer hybrid or remote work. So this is kind of the new normal, right? And I'm sure all of you know this. But in addition to that, people who are already working remote, 57% of those people are considering a shift to hybrid. So they want a little bit more contact with people, a little bit more face-to-face interaction with people, sometimes working at home, sometimes going into the office, right? And then for people who are already working in a hybrid environment, actually 51% of those people are considering a shift to going fully remote. So this is kind of the new working environment that people are expecting. Some want a little bit of contact at the office, in-person contact. Some people prefer to go fully remote. Now, some interesting research from Microsoft. Microsoft what they did was they measured people who are working in their offices around the world and at home. And they were measuring keyboard click rates in Microsoft applications, Teams, and those other types of Microsoft applications. And what they found was that before, we used to have 2 peaks in our workday. And so the first peak would be before lunchtime, sometime between 10 and 11 a.m. The second peak in activity, work activity, would be somewhere around 2 to 3 p.m. And then it would gradually go down. But since the pandemic, there has actually been 3 peaks in activity. Now you can see this third peak in the lower right side here. And it looks small, but it looks small because it's 30% of workers. So 30% of people at home are starting to do more activity late at night. And for this 30% of employees, the amount of activity that they're doing is actually equal to the amount of activity that they would be doing at 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning. So, this could be people who are married and have children. So maybe during the daytime, they'll take their kids to school. In the evening, get dinner ready, put their kids to bed, and then decide to do a little bit more work before going to sleep. But it could also be people who are just naturally more productive in the evening and at night. And this is one reason that they like remote work. So there are various types of groups in this 30% and various reasons why they're starting to work a little bit more in the evening. But the important point here is that we're now identifying a third peak during the day. But even though people feel a little bit more flexibility with working at home, burnout has become a real risk, right? And I'm sure all of you know this. But if you look at this graph here, you can see that starting in March of 2020, compared to March of 2020, meetings have increased by 153%. That's a huge amount of increase in meeting time for people. Chats have increased by about 32%. After hours work, working after your standard normal workday hours has increased by 28%. And the workday has increased by 13%. So we have to consider, especially about meetings, do we need to have meetings for certain topics? We have to be a little bit more careful about who we decide should be in the meeting, whether we should be having a meeting. Maybe some things can be handled more effectively through email or through chat. But 153% increase in meeting time, there's a higher risk of burnout for workers. Now, another issue that has come up from the pandemic is there has been a change in frequency of interactions for employees, of course, right? But if we look at the graph here, the line graph here, the yellow line represents close networks. So for example, this means interactions with people in your team already, people that you usually interact with on a daily basis or weekly basis. Now the red line represents more distant networks. These are more distant interactions. So for example, interacting with people who are on a different team or a different department in my organization. And so what we found is that since the beginning of the pandemic, the number of interactions with people who are in other teams or other departments has decreased significantly. So there's a real risk here of people being siloed and they're communicating within their teams, but less likely to communicate with people who are outside their teams. So what can we do better here? There are a few things. And the first is to consider what type of work should be synchronous. Synchronous means everybody should participate at the same time. And what type of work should be asynchronous, which means that people don't all need to be there at the same time. And this is something that we should, especially managers, team leaders, should be considering about meetings. Is, does everybody need to be in this meeting? Or, can somebody sit out this meeting and be in a different meeting, right? So considering whether the work is synchronous or asynchronous. Now, also related to meetings, another thing that we can do is we have the functionality to record meetings now, right? Whether we're in Zoom or Microsoft Teams. So for people who don't necessarily need to be in the meeting, we can record the meetings so that they can watch it later. Now, another thing that we need to consider is some people are night owls. They tend to be really productive at night, tend to prefer working in night hours. And some people prefer to be working during daytime hours. So it's a good idea for team leaders to have that discussion with their team members to find out, when are people more productive? When do they prefer to work? For people who are working remotely and hybrid, and to try to be flexible about scheduling with those people. And then, of course, it's very important for managers and team leaders to model what type of behavior they expect from their team members. And also just to care about other employees who are working remotely, sometimes to check in, to coach with them. And this can result in an increase of engagement. And then finally, it's important for team leaders to create and share kind of sustainable working practices with their team members. Some have recommended creating a team agreement, and this can involve discussions about what do we expect in work behavior from our team members, in a hybrid or remote environment, right? This can be things about scheduling. It can be things about how much time you should spend on individually on focused work, as opposed to spending time more in collaboration work with groups or more than one people. So these are some of the things that we can do better, okay? Now, given the situation, how can we strengthen alignment and engagement? This is one of the more significant challenges during the pandemic and with people, the new normal of people working at home. And so one important thing here is that performance management is more important than ever and is more challenging than ever. And so before I talk about performance management, I'd like to ask you a second question, poll question number 2. And the question here is, what do you think is the biggest success factor for effective performance management? Okay. And so your choices here are annual reviews, compensation or pay, frequent one-on-ones with managers, having autonomy to create your own goals, or team collaboration. So go ahead and input your answers there. And I'll give you about 15 seconds here. Okay, and time? Okay, very good. And so, interesting. So 6% feel annual reviews are the most important, 8% compensation, 42% frequent one-on-ones with managers. Very interesting. 25% the autonomy to create their own goals, and team collaboration, 19%. So let's talk about this a little bit more. According to McKinsey, 54% of employees say that performance reviews have actually had no positive effect on performance. And they say that, in fact, performance reviews are doing more harm than good. Now, this may be a little bit surprising. So let's talk about why isn't it working? What are the problems? And there are 2 specific areas where we can identify problems. The first is the annual review process itself, and the second is engagement. Now, different companies have different practices and different ways to conduct the review process. But for those who are conducting annual reviews, 3 problems that have come up is, the first is biased rating. So this means that if I'm a manager and I'm doing an annual review with one of my subordinates, maybe what I consider to be high performance is decided by my own image or ideas of performance, right? So if I'm evaluating someone on critical thinking skills, my rating is going to be influenced by what I consider about critical thinking skills. So bias rating is a real problem with reviews. According to some research, biased rating can affect reviews by as much as 62%. So this is something important to consider about when you're reviewing employees. The second problem is that annual reviews tend to be too infrequent, right? And focused on the past performance of the employee. So, some companies have a review process where they do a mid-year review and then a review at the end of the year again. Some companies just do it one time at the end of the year. The problem here is that for employees who are trying to perform, by the time that you have the annual review, it's too late. There are things that they were doing and performing that they needed to discuss at that time, not at the mid-year point or at the end of the year. Now, the third issue of the annual review process is for some companies where they tie the process to compensation, that creates also a lot of issues. So for example, some employees, when they're setting their goals for the year, some employees will not stretch their goals, and they will set very conservative goals to make sure they meet their targets because it's tied to their compensation. Now, in terms of engagement, three issues that we can see. The first is lack of clarity and priorities. So for employees who are setting their goals at the beginning of the year and not reviewing them until the end of the year, in traditional performance management systems in companies, they tend not to be able to see what other people are working on in the organization. And because it's not reviewed until the end of the year, there tends to be a lack of clarity. So the second one is many employees feel there's a lack of coaching and opportunities to learn. And so the current process of setting reviews mid-year or at the end of the year, again, is too infrequent. People want to have coaching and feedback more often and more frequently. Now, the third issue is interesting. It's lack of accountability. And what this means is, if you look at research of millennials and Generation Z, one thing that they prefer in a workplace is having more accountability, actually, being able to have more autonomy, to be able to make more decisions about how they are going to do things at work. And so currently with the traditional annual review process, there is a lack of autonomy and accountability. So these are some of the issues that that workers feel are a problem with a traditional annual review performance management system. And with millennials and Generation Z, expectations have changed about why they want to work at a company. So compared to, for example, 25, 30 years ago, one of the key reasons that people wanted to work was for compensation, for pay. Whereas with a lot of millennials, Generation Z, they want to feel a sense of purpose in their job. That's very important for them. Another expectation that has changed is the role of managers and team leaders and leadership, where workers don't want a boss, they want a coach, someone who can help them to grow their skills and advance in the company. Now, a third expectation that has changed is employees want to focus more on discussing their strengths and how to utilize their strengths more effectively, and not just focus, for example, on what their weak points are or what they need to do better. Okay. And then finally, millennials and Generation Z want to focus less on what their score is in an evaluation, and they want to focus more on how can they grow and increase their skills and increase their performance. So what are companies doing to retailor their performance management systems? A lot of companies have changed their performance management system within the last 5 to 10 years. And a lot of companies are dropping the annual review process, and they're doing a few things differently now. Now, two things that they're doing is they're focusing more on fast goals for aligned and purpose-driven performance. And don't worry if you don't understand what fast goals are. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. And the second thing that they're doing is they are adopting a more frequent feedback and discussions between team leaders and team members to be more agile in performance and to focus on growth. So let's go ahead and start with the first one, which is FAST goals. FAST goals stand for frequent, so more frequent discussions for agile performance. Ambitious, stretching and growing performance. So when they set goals, they are not setting goals just to hit a mark. They're setting goals to stretch and go beyond what they expect. The third one is specific, and this means using quantitative metrics and measurements to measure and track your performance. And then T stands for transparent, which means having visibility to see what other people in the organization, what their goals are, what they are doing, what is their performance like, and this can create better alignment for goals and priorities. So for these 4 parts of FAST goals, let's start by talking about the S in FAST, specific. So many companies these days have shifted to setting goals with a system called OKRs. Now, OKRs are a little bit different. Some of you may be familiar with them. Some of you may not. But OKRs are divided into 2 parts when you're setting your goals. The first part is setting your objective. And objectives are, what do you hope to achieve? What do you want to achieve? And then after setting the goal, setting what type of key results would tell you that you have reached the goal. So this is, how do you know when you've achieved your objective? Now, objectives, when people are setting their objectives, it's more qualitative, not quantitative, not using numbers. They're concise, and good OKRs are also time-bound. So they set a time limit when you should finish it by. They're focused on adding business value and being aligned with other goals of team members or other departments or other teams. So when people set their goals with OKRs, there are 5 things that they're considering when they're deciding how to set the goal. Now, in terms of key results, how do they measure those goals? They set up measurements that are quantitative, that are specific, that are ambitious to stretch themselves, that are progress-based. So they can focus on making progress within a quarter or within a month, and goals that can promote accountability from them. So workers want to be able to set their own key results in order to push themselves and to have more accountability and autonomy. Now, let's take a look at an example here of an OKR. So if I'm setting the objective, the example here is develop best in-class customer experience on our website. So this is a qualitative goal, not quantitative. It's concise, right? It's connected, relevant to add business value to my company. And in terms of key results that I would set up for this goal, maybe one would be exit survey CSAT score higher than 85%. This is a little bit ambitious. Average cart value increased by 15%. Again, an ambitious key result. And monthly returning customers greater than 15%. All of these are quantitative. They have some specific way that I can measure whether I have achieved my objective or not. And usually with OKRs, we set about anywhere from 2 to 4 key results. And the key results, if I meet all of these key results, then that means that I have achieved my objective. So this is a specific, measurable way to track, progress of your goals and your performance. Now, the second part of FAST goals is ambitious. And ambitious goals means that setting goals where we stretch ourselves to perform beyond our expectations, right? So with OKRs, 60 to 70% achievement rate is actually normal. If you are achieving 100% of your goals, then you're actually not stretching yourself. You're not trying to challenge yourself. So a 60 to 70% achievement rate is actually normal for OKRs. Now, setting your expectations to 60 to 70% minimizes the risk of sandbagging. Now, sandbagging means when I set my expectations for my goals low because I want to achieve 100%, right? So I'm not really challenging myself, and this is called sandbagging. So with OKRs, setting key results ambitiously means that we are trying to grow, we are trying to change, we're trying to have an impact on our organization's business. So this is not, OKRs are not business as usual. They are not the same as, for example, KPIs. KPIs measure the day-to-day. OKRs are about prioritizing the most important objectives that you want to achieve, and then to do those ambitiously. So it's about growth and performance and impact on the organization. Now, the T in FAST is about transparent. And this is actually very key and very important for performance management. In research, one moment here, conducted by MIT, they found that 25% of middle managers, only 25% of middle managers know their company's strategic priorities. And I'm wondering for all of you here today, how many of you know your company's strategic priorities right now? Now, what they also found was 25% of managers said that their goals were understood by other units. Only 25%. So that means that there is a lack of alignment and transparency of understanding what other teams are doing within the organization, what other business units are doing within the organization. Now, on the other hand, according to Gallup, research shows that if there is goal alignment, if you're able to see what other people, what their goals are, what their progress on their goals are, what their key results are, productivity increases by 56%. And so visibility and transparency means being able to see beyond yourself at what goals other people are pursuing, right? And what their progress is and what the results are. And this could be horizontally, where you are able to see what someone on a different team is doing, right? And it could be vertically, where you can actually see what your manager's goals are and what leadership's goals are and what they're working on. And the importance of having horizontal and vertical alignment is that you are able to more effectively align your goals, right? So that has more business impact for your organization. And also to create more understanding of how your goals are connected to the organization's priorities. This is one thing that, according to research, a lot of employees right now don't feel that they can see how their goals are aligned to the organization's objectives. So visibility and transparency is very important to create this sense of understanding, this sense of connection and alignment, right? Now, another thing that some companies are doing with OKRs is, as a team, they're creating alignment on individual OKRs within the team. So for example, after each individual sets their objectives and key results, then they will come together, present them as a team, agree on them as a team, and this creates more ownership and accountability because you're publicly agreeing with everybody else that this is what you're going to do, right? And it also tends to build trust and collaboration as people can see what we're doing and we can support each other. Now, some interesting research, there is a company called BetterWorks. BetterWorks provides OKR software and solutions. And so their customers, their clients are companies that can use their OKR system. And so they can see what other teams in their organization are working on. They can see what their leaders are working on. They can see their objectives. They can see what key results they're trying to achieve and what their progress is. And within these companies, employees are actually checking what other teams, other units are doing 4 times more than they're checking what their teams are doing, right? So this shows that there's a great interest in employees of trying to align, trying to understand what other teams are doing, and so that they can align to that more effectively. I'm not sure how many of you know Marcel Tellis. I think a very small percentage of you. Marcel Tellis was the CEO from 1989 to 1999 of Brahma in Brazil. Brahma was a beer maker in Brazil. And when Marcel Tellis became the CEO there, the first thing that he did was he took down the walls in the office, took down the cubicles. He had the managers continually meet at one table to discuss openly what their goals were, what their priorities were, to create better alignment. And what he also did was he focused on fewer priorities, only on what was important. There are many opportunities for companies to pursue, but what Tellis wanted to do was to focus only on the few that would produce critical growth for his company. And the third thing that he did was he required managers to post what their goals and current progress was so that everybody in the company could see it clearly. And this created better alignment, created a more competitive working culture. And Brahma, through acquisitions and mergers, became AB InBev. So this is where AB InBev came from. And a significant part of how they were able to have a growth culture was connected to being able to see, having visibility and transparency of what everybody was doing in order to create better alignment as an organization. Now, what are the benefits of transparency? As I said before, it creates vertical and horizontal alignment. It incentivizes teams to perform on their own goals. If other teams and other departments can see what my goals are, I'm much more likely to try to achieve my goals, right? Third, it increases communication and collaboration, especially with teams who are working on a project that other teams may influence or have an impact on. It's very important that there be collaboration between those teams, right? And then finally, it allows for agile support, troubleshooting, and pivoting. I can see quickly if another team is having issues, and I can help them, support them, and respond more quickly. Now, the last part of OKRs, which is important, is frequency. 68% of employees report that ongoing coaching and feedback has a positive impact on their individual performance. Frequent means weekly or bi-weekly check-ins, okay? And frequency, it creates agility. Now, with the traditional model, goals are set at the beginning of the year, and then there's a review mid-year and an annual review at the end of the year. So this is infrequent, and these reviews tend to be after the fact and untimely because you can't discuss what you're currently working on at that time. Now, on the other hand, the FAST model, you're setting goals quarterly. So more frequent goal setting, right? And then you're having weekly check-ins or bi-weekly check-ins and discussions with your manager or your team leader. So this allows the managers and team leaders to have discussions to focus on what's currently happening, not what happened in the past year. So it's more focused on what's happening right now, what's happening in the near future. Yeah, frequent discussions can be weekly, they could be bi-weekly check-ins. Deloitte consultancy, who started to have more frequent discussions in, I think, 2018, they require the employees to schedule the check-in with the manager so that the employees, the team members, are taking on more accountability for having these frequent discussions. The frequency of the discussions is often more important than the length of the discussions. Even if you're discussing for 15 minutes, if you're doing it frequently, it has an impact on performance. And then finally, frequency allows for more agile decision-making as you can discuss issues that come up more frequently and make quicker changes and adjustments, right? For managers and team leaders, the challenge is that frequent discussions require coaching skills. And coaching skills are not easy, right? You are helping someone to clarify their thinking about their key priorities, their key challenges. And this requires a different skill set than we are used to. It requires active listening skills, being able to ask questions effectively for employees to be able to talk and think through critical issues. It also involves giving feedback and then also giving recognition. This allows employees to feel a sense of more autonomy and taking on ownership of what they're doing. And so it creates faster growth and more quick improvements in performance. According to research by Gartner, a research consultancy, the impact of effective coaching is strong. 26% of managers reported an increase in performance through coaching. 38% reported an increase in discretionary effort. And 40% reported an increase in engagement. So the impact of coaching is real. So I'm going to close here by saying that according to McKinsey, there are 3 things that you can do to have an impact on your performance management system that will affect the fairness from the employee's perspective, right? The first one is, as I discussed before, linking performance goals to the business's priorities, creating transparency. The second one is more frequent coaching by managers. And the third one is separating the discussion about compensation from discussion of performance. So regarding performance in remote time, fast goals, frequent check-ins with managers, drive agility and performance, especially in remote times where people who are isolated from the office need to feel engaged. Second, organization-wide visibility of goals and priorities can align employees who are working from home. And finally, fast goals with coaching can help to build autonomy and a feeling of ownership to perform beyond the business as usual. Okay, so I'd like to close with one final question, one final poll question. And the question here is, which component of performance management would you like your company to focus more on in the future? And I'll give you 30 seconds to answer that question. Okay, and time. Okay, so interesting. 25% of you talked about transparency and alignment of goals, and 33% development of coaching skills, 8% adoption of OKR goal system, 28% more frequent discussions between managers and members, and 6% adoption of ambitious goal setting. Interesting. Okay, so I'd like to go ahead and open up the Q&A here. If any of you have questions, I would be happy to take a few minutes here to answer and provide some feedback. Okay.
Okay, we have received several questions. So maybe we cannot answer all, but having a priority on the meetings and increasing a check-in, how can we manage those two things?
I think one thing is, as I discussed before, one thing that some companies are doing in terms of setting their goals and their objectives for performance is having the teams discuss them together as a whole and agreeing to them, right? So that's one thing that can create engagement in terms of working on teams. The other thing is, I think it's important for team leaders, managers, to be able to, as I mentioned before, set up standard sustainable working practices, especially in a remote environment, so that employees are clear about what the expected behavior is, what our schedules are going to look like, and so on.
Okay. The next one is...
I can see, do you mind if I take, I can see two questions here in Q&A. Do you mind if I take these questions?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the first question is, does US major companies promote working remotely? How is it different in Japan? I think there's not a big difference. Companies, both in Japan and the US, are talking about hybrid work being the new normal, right? I think that companies in the US, there's a stronger push from employees for companies to adopt better remote working, more flexible remote working policies for them. And the reason is that workers in the US have a little bit more power right now than workers in Japan. As I mentioned before, during the Great Resignation, millions and millions of people left their companies for better opportunities. And so the power balance has kind of shifted a little bit, where employees can demand a little bit more from companies. And one thing that they're demanding is more of a focus on flexible remote working policies. Interestingly, some companies, a few companies have gone completely remote, right? I don't know if you have noticed in the news recently, but the company Yelp, which Yelp is a website and also application, a social application to give reviews about restaurants or shops or entertainment. They announced very recently that they are closing their offices and they're going completely remote. They did some surveys within their company, and they found that 86% of employees wanted to go just completely full remote. I think 89% said that they were just effective in performance as in face-to-face, so they prefer remote. So I think some companies in the US are being pushed to be a little bit more flexible about that. Let me take a second question here. For the expectations and Generation Z, is there expectation for self or in consideration of a team? Younger people is more focused on self. I think there's a combination here. I think both of those are connected, where, especially for younger workers, they want to feel a sense of purpose in their work, and being connected and engaged with their teams. And something I talked about before, being able to see how what they are doing is connected to the organization. This is something that they desire. So it's kind of a mix of both for their self and for the team, actually. Okay, a third company is, do you think that the culture influenced FAST model? I think culture is a significant influence on the FAST model, right? If you don't have a culture where you are allowing your employees to take on responsibility, take on decision-making about how they're going to do something, then the FAST model is less likely to work in those organizations. I also think the culture of being able to communicate more frequently, whether that's with managers and team leaders who show more of an openness to talking with their team members, and also to talking and communicating with people in other teams and organizations, that has a huge impact on the FAST model, right? Okay. And let me take one more question here. Are there any good tools or programs to train managers on conducting effective performance reviews and providing employees with coaching? Effective performance reviews are difficult. And the reason is, I mentioned it before, but if you're conducting reviews just to give feedback, then that's okay, right? You can do that, and you can be trained to do that. But if you're doing it to give a rating or a score to an employee, it's something that there's a lot of bias that can go into the calculation. And so it's you should be aware that there's a risk there doing that. In terms of training for coaching, there is training for that. And if there's one thing that has a significant impact on employees feeling engaged and feeling that the performance management system of their company is good, it's coaching, actually. It usually has the biggest effect. So that is one thing that I would highly recommend. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the questions here. We have one more question. Let me see if I can take this real quick. Is it better just to have qualitative evaluation than qualitative but challenges? How do you translate to reward? I'm not sure I understand the question here. Quantitative. Quantitative, is it better to have quantitative evaluation? If you're, for example, using OKRs, where you have your objectives and your key results, the key results are the quantitative metrics that you can use to measure the progress that people are having in achieving their goals, right? The most important thing, I think, is not to tie compensation to that discussion, because with OKRs, one of the points is trying to grow and challenge yourself to have more impact on your organization. And so to do that, you're going to set goals beyond what you can achieve, what is realistically achievable. And usually you're going to get like a 60 to 70% achievement rate. So I think that it's important to separate compensation from that discussion. Thank you very much. So, okay, the last question I'll just take real quick. What is a good basis for compensation then? Many companies this is a problem that they're working out right now, right? And so there is not a standard answer to this question right now. But what a lot of companies are doing is they're looking at a lot of different factors now, not just have you reached your goals right now. How far you have made progress in reaching your goals can be a small part of that equation, can be one part. But there are other factors too. So for example, how much value are you adding to your team's performance is one, right? So a lot of companies are considering different criteria that they can use now to measure compensation, but not just, did you reach your goals or not? Okay. Okay, thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. That was a really helpful information. Thank you very much. それでは少し時間が過ぎてしまいましたが、アレンさんのご講演、これにて終了となります。本日のセミナーに関しましては、皆様にアンケートをお願いしております。アンケートはですね、チャットボックスのところに、リンクが、今、ドロップされましたので、こちらの方をクリックして、回答の方をご協力いただければ幸いでございます。よろしくお願いいたします。最後にJCCNC タスクフォースの方からお知らせがございます。8月の5日の金曜日の夕方5時から、JCCNC 事務局ビル5の会議室にて、タスクフォース主催によるハッピーアワーワインテイスティング交流会を開催いたします。当日はソムリエの資格を持つ現役キャビンアテンダントさんやワインに詳しいボランティアの方々も参加いただきまして、ゲームなどを企画しております。申し込みは事務局より配信されますイベントブライトのリンクよりお申し込みください。会員の皆様との親睦を深めるためにも、ぜひご参加の方よろしくお願いいたします。本日はご参加いただきましてありがとうございました。これにて失礼いたします。ありがとうございました。